as I said at the start, the method I'm demonstrating here is for attaching bands in the round. That means the band is sewn into a loop before it's attached, like these ones I was already showing here. I don't know where my other one went. Oh, here it is. So that's what you would use for attaching in the round. But bands can be attached flat instead. It's not my preferred method for neck bands, and here's why. On the samples here, I attached the cuff flat rather than round. In other words, here it is here. In other words, the cuff wasn't sewn into a loop first. The sleeve, this was seamed into a tube. It wasn't seamed into a tube. Okay, so both the pieces of fabric can lie flat here. Here's the good examples. Here's what it looked like. Okay, so here is the cuff, but instead of sewing this seam first to make it, a cuff like this that's a loop, instead of doing that, I just serged it flat like this. And that's certainly easier to serge this piece on than doing it in the round. But the problem is, when I go to seam it, now I have to do a seam that goes all the way down the shirt sleeve or pants, like whatever it is, to the edge. And so what you're going to get is something like this, where you have the seam on the inside as opposed to having this be all clean. This is actually the seam. You can hardly see it. I mean, and you can definitely tuck that little tail out of the way. That's not a big deal. But it just doesn't feel as good to the wearer. And also, it's really hard when you're serging this like this with this method of you applying the cuff or the neckband on a shirt flat like that. It's really hard to keep these two edges lined up and have that look nice. So I don't like that method. I mean, it's faster in a way, but it's harder to make it look nice. So, and like I say, I don't think it feels as good to the wearer. But everybody has their own thing. You can certainly apply the band flat if you want. On a knit shirt, if you wanted to apply a band flat, you would just sew up one shoulder seam. Let's see, it's kind of hard to tell. This is a shirt here, but you can see I have one shoulder seam sewn up here. This one is not sewn up yet. So now I could apply a band flat. I would just get my long band and serge it right on there. But this one I'm not going to do that way. I'm going to do it my method I like in the round. So I'm sewing up both shoulder seams. Although I did, by the way, sew the sleeve on. I haven't done the other sleeve yet. But I do sew those flat on a knit shirt. So what I would typically, the way I would do that is open up that part of the shirt there. I mark the center of the sleeve. But typically knit shirts are the same in the front and back. They're bilaterally symmetrical. I don't know. But I put that little notch right on the shoulder seam because that's the halfway points. I would pin in this situation, but as you can see, the pin's far from where the blades are going to hit. And then I match up the start here, and that way I make sure that this will be evenly distributed. So that I do use that flat method for sleeves because it's not a problem. You don't have bulk like with a cuff. It's not 2 layers. And then what you do is you do the seam of the side seam and the sleeve. See, here's the little sleeve sticking out. You do that in one pass, just straight down. It's hard to see, that thread is kind of light colored, but yeah, you just serge that entire edge, the side seam and the underarm seam. So I do that. To prep the band itself, let's talk about how you would get that band ready to go. You just put the right sides together and you're going to sew this short little seam right here like this. This is we're making it into a tube. And your pattern's going to tell you how tall and long to cut it, or if you're making your own, you're going to have to experiment if you're doing your own pattern. But this is just a tiny, tiny little seam. And so I use a straight stitch because I want to be able to press it open and avoid bulk. I mean, it's not going to show or need to stretch anyway. The seam is, the raw edges there are going to be encased in the inside there. And plus I can cut away this extra bulk in here. The one other tip about preparing this is, well, these flimsy knits can be really difficult to get started on a short little seam. It's deceptive. So you can put, if you want, you can put a little piece of exam room tissue under this right on the machine, sew right through it, and rip it off. I don't have to do that on all fabrics, but that can be a good trick if it's not feeding nice. Another trick is don't backstitch. On a little seam like this with a flimsy knit, if you start backstitching, a lot of times the fabric just folds up. It gets a crease and it gets all wadded up and it's not very nice. So instead, because if you use a regular stitch length, it's going to, your stitches might pull out if you don't backstitch. So what you can do instead is start with a very short stitch length. Just turn your stitch length way down, and then after you go on a quarter inch or a few stitches or something, then you can open up the stitch length, and then as you get to the end, same thing, shorten that stitch, and that way you have a stitch that's not going to pull out. It's going to be plenty strong. I didn't start at the exact edge there, but it works. I probably use a little too long of a stitch here, but that straight stitch will work fine for that. One last tip on doing these seams on a flimsy knit especially. Here is a really flimsy, slippery lycra fabric, and it's going to be a cuff. So I have to sew down here, and I'm going to straight stitch. But keeping these things lined up when you start can be such a bear. So I use glue stick. It won't hurt your machine. All I do is I just put a little tiny dab of glue stick there and get it all lined up, and presto, it'll stay right in place. Okay, let's see here. It'll stay nice and flat. So then also you can iron that. If the fabric can be ironed, it's okay to just finger press it, but I'll give it a little press if I can. And then I also like to, I get the raw edges lined up all nice and straight, and then you may have noticed on this neckband I basted these raw edges together. When you attach this to the garment, you are going to be serging 3 layers together. You got the 2 raw edges of that band and then the raw edge of your shirt, and it can be really tricky to keep that all lined up nice. And if you don't keep it all lined up nice, on a skinny band it really shows if you go wide and then narrow. So if you baste these edges, raw edges together, and you can kind of stretch it as you baste so they won't pop, but if they pop, it's okay. This is just basting, just temporary. It'll still mostly hold these raw edges together, and then you have only, essentially, you've made it, now there's only 2 pieces of fabric you have to line up. And so that will greatly ease your operation there. I usually baste it, those 2 raw edges, pretty close to the edge, because that way I can just let them pop and I don't even have to pull them out. You could pull out the stitches if you want. But when I get close, when I get the 2 inches on either side of the seam, you notice I went, it was messy, it's just basting, but I went a little further in. I went like a 1/4 inch in, because that's where I'm going to notch. And notching is what we will show next up in part 2.